And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Good evening. Welcome to the program tonight. In a moment, we'll hear from Mpumi Zikalala, the CEO at Kumba Iron Ore. All sorts of things going on, largely to do with railway lines. Does look like big changes are in store as well. We'll hear from her in just a moment. Scott Cummins, the CEO of Avenge, talking today about some of the problems they've had with a big hydroelectric project. It's a world first. The idea is to basically use, I suppose you could call it the hole left by a disused gold mine in Australia, and turn that into a massive hydroelectric facility. They've had some problems with that, and we'll have a look at that this evening. But the story that really caught my eye, you might have seen it. Montego, they make dog food, and Bobtail, yeah, they also make dog food, having a big fight over which one is the leading brand of dog food. First, when I had to scratch my head was, who do you ask? I mean, which is better? Don't ask me. I don't know who you ask. Very strange story. Looking forward to that conversation this evening. And, of course, plenty of speculation still tonight around what's going to happen with the budget. Enoch Godongwana, I'm not sure how much sleep the finance minister is going to be getting this evening. But a little bit of tossing and turning tonight, I suspect, about whether there will be a larger tax take, whether the amount of tax that you pay, a larger tax burden, is actually on the cards or not. And I noticed Edward Kisvetter, the SARS commissioner, and this has come back from comments he made back in January, suggesting that, in fact, increased taxes would be counterproductive. Big conversations about that this evening. You may well have a view. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. And, of course, voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, Kumba Iron Ore today reporting a 45% drop in profits in its financial year to the end of December. But the company looking to the future, saying the problems it's having with Transnet and the railway from Sishen in the Northern Cape to Saldanha Bay might be eased significantly. It'll take a while, 18 months or so, but changes on the cards. Sishen produced 35.7 million tonnes of ore. 35.6 million tonnes of that were sent to Saldanha by rail. Mpumi Zikalala is the CEO at Kumba. Mpumi, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. And I suppose the fact that you have a stockpile of over 7 million tonnes of ore, really shows you what your major problem is. It's all about capacity on the railway line.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you so much for having me. I spoke earlier about the fact that we saw a 21% reduction in our revenue, and that was primarily driven by a couple of factors. The first one is that we saw slightly weaker iron ore prices driven by the markets. And then the second aspect was the fact that we actually have seen continued challenges from a Transnet perspective. But as you said, there are a couple of green shoots that we are starting to see driven by the collaboration.
What's making you so confident? What's happening at Transnet that's making you a bit upbeat about the future?
So a couple of things. So firstly, let me qualify the positives. So if you look at our full year, we actually continue to see a reduction in terms of our sales volumes. But when one looks at the fourth quarter of last year specifically, relative to the fourth quarter of 2023, we actually saw a 5% increase in performance. We do still have a couple of challenges, and we clearly, in line with the challenges, saw a couple of train derailments, which are things that Transnet and ourselves are working on. But why are we positive? I mean, a couple of things, Stephen. Firstly, we completed, and this is us as Kumba, as a member of the Ore Users Forum, which includes all the other users of the line, together with Transnet, the independent technical assessment. And what was pleasing was the fact that as part of that, Transnet was absolutely transparent around the essence of looking at everything around this channel and figuring out what it is that needs to be fixed. Coming out of that, we are now together working on the Ore Corridor Restoration Program. And again, there's absolute transparency from Transnet, and we are working together on the co-creation of the plan and also looking at how this will be rolled out in future. We do understand that this will take some time because it clearly took a little bit of, actually quite a bit of time for us to see the reduction in performance. The other thing that we are very constructive about which is a real positive, not just for Kumba, but for our country as a whole, is that we've started to see some real movements around both the policy and structural reforms. We saw the white paper on rail a couple of years back coming out from the Department of Transport. That was followed by the Freight Logistics Roadmap. And more recently, we saw the network statement coming out. And we understand that the Department of Transport will, in the next couple of weeks, open up an RFI or a request for information process, which will allow various private sector players to come forward with their ideas around how they would like to see private sector or greater private sector participation. And we are really positive around this because we do believe, and we all know, that Transnet cannot resolve the challenges on its own. Sure. We do need to see greater private sector participation for us to see the real difference. Just one thing, Stephen, it won't take 18 months. It's going to take longer than 18 months. But fundamentally, there's an understanding of what the challenges are. There's a short-term plan that we are all working on around the Ore Corridor Restoration Program. And then there's positivity around the private sector participation phase.
Sure. The private operators, I mean, could you be one of the private operators that actually end up running carriages on the line? Is that an option for you?
So when looking at the ore export channel, it's just over 860 kilometers of rail from our mines in the Northern Cape, and it runs all the way to Saldanha. And it's a single line that has passing loops, and it's well integrated with the port. So within the greater private sector participation space, we have spoken around the fact that that could possibly be a channel that could be concessioned, because one would want to see the overall improvement in the integrated system. And that is what we believe greater private sector participation will actually enable. And we are working together with the Ore Users Forum around what it is that our submission will be when the RFI process gets opened. And the criticality of us working together is fundamentally premised around the fact that we all understand the challenges. And this is not a space where we essentially compete. We understand that if one gets this right, it's for the benefit of the country as a whole.
So I just want to understand, would you be looking at running railway carriages yourself, or would it be through someone else?
So we are very much open to working with others around the concessioning of this line. I think the key thing around this, Stephen, is that there's no one single player that's got all the answers. There is a need for greater private sector collaboration and partnership. And this is where, as Kumba, we are working with the other users of the line. And we certainly are looking forward to making a submission as part of the Ore Users Forum, just around what it is that this could look like. Sure. Key is it's the essence of exploring private sector participation.
Okay. The other thing you're working on, it's called the Ultra High Density Media Separation Project. And as I understand it, it helps you to produce better quality iron, I presume, purer iron. You're spending 11.6 billion rand on it. It's clearly an important project for you.
It's an absolutely fantastic project, and we're pleased when our board approved the expenditure of the 11.2 billion rands on this. And the fantastic thing is that it's a technology project that is upgrading our current dense medium separation plant into an ultra-high dense medium separation plant. And that will allow us to treat lower grade material that we currently cannot beneficiate. So this material is material that's going into the waste stream. We'll be able to treat it. And secondly, because we will be treating this material, it will allow us to actually reduce our strip ratio at Sishen, and as a result, allow us to reduce the unit cost of running our Sishen mine. Again, the technology is fantastic because we'll get to improve the quality of our product. And as I say to people, if you then look at all these factors combined, it's giving us the optionality for us to extend the life of Sishen. For these results, we gave an indication that the life of mine of Sishen has improved by 2 years, but we've got more optionality around the space. And this technology, it's wonderful, and I am a process engineer, so I understand the full benefits, will allow us to further extend the life of mine of Sishen. And if you think about it, it's fantastic for our employees, and it's also fantastic for our communities and the country as a whole.
Mpumi Zikalala, really appreciate the time tonight. Thank you. The CEO at Kumba.
7:02.
7:02.
Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Confirmation from the engineering construction infrastructure group Avenge today. It made a headline loss of around $400 million in the year to the end of December. The two projects in Australia and Singapore creating, well, if you do the maths together in rands, quite a big combined loss of nearly 900 million rand in the last year. But Avenge saying the other projects in his portfolio are making a profit. The CEO at Avenge is Scott Cummins. Scott, good evening to you and thanks for your time. So these two big projects, there's the Kidson project in Queensland, and let's look at that first. You're turning an old gold mine into a storage facility for a hydroelectric project. What kind of problems are you having with the process?
Yeah, good evening, Stephen. Nice to speak to you. Yes, the Kidston project is it's a very special project. You know, it's all associated with the new energy and alternative energy and so forth. So it was a project we tendered back in 1990, awarded in 2020. And you can imagine a project of this nature has a number of phases to it, a number of components. You have an upper dam, you have a lower dam, you have a big powerhouse where the turbines go, you have, the down chute that the water flows through to get to the turbines, and then you have, an exit where the water goes into the lower dam. So we've been working at this job for a number of years, all through the COVID period, and it's experienced all of that hyper-escalation period after COVID as well. Look, and it's been going along okay. Until we got to the point where we were doing the structural works inside the cavern, which houses the two 125 megawatt turbine generators. And you can imagine supporting and founding generations of that generators of that size and the forces associated with the water that flows down. The structure that's required to support that is pretty substantial. High strength concrete, lots of reinforcement that goes within that concrete. And we estimated what the productivity is associated with doing that work some time ago. And only recently have we got to that aspect of the project. And when we started doing that work, we found we were just unable to achieve the productivities assumed. We took what were considered positions for the productivity, but for various reasons we just couldn't get there. The size of the rebar, the complexity of the concrete works, the confined space of working inside the cavern just meant that we weren't able to achieve the productivity. So we had to reassess the cost to complete, absorbed the schedule impact, and so in essence we've lost 2 to 3 months on the schedule and the cost increase associated with it. So that's what's occurred on that project, and we'll continue on now with the assumed productivities, which are actually equal to what's been achieved on site, which is giving us confidence that we've got the cost to complete as we stand here right now.
As I understand it, this hasn't really been done in this particular way anywhere before. Are you confident it can be done?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the engineering solution is sound. So we've just had an issue here with the assumed productivities for doing the work. The type of work involved is well-proven engineering, and we're well advanced with it now. The turbine generators that go in place are stock standard that are being used around the world. The principles are very solid. So you're right. Converting a gold mine into a pumped hydro scheme is not something that's done every day, but all of the principles that behind it that support it are very well proven. So there's absolutely no reason whatsoever why it won't result in a successful outcome.
Okay. The Jurong Region Line project, this is the other big project. It's in Singapore. You're basically creating, it's sort of rapid mass transit stations. It's sort of parts of a railway line, essentially, rail viaducts, things like that. You've had some problems there too, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately as well. Again, there was a project that was tendered and awarded in the same time frame, 2019, 2020. It's an elevated viaduct with 3 elevated stations. And originally when that job was tendered, it was going to be done in a greenfield environment, so there was not going to be any community activity around the work site. But as a consequence of priority being given to the housing development in the area, we're actually now ending up building that viaduct and those stations in amongst a live community. So we're having to lift components over, buses taking kids to school and so there's a lot of disruption that has hit the project. That combined with hyper-escalation that's well documented, that's hit a lot of countries around the world post-COVID, has put a lot of strain on the subcontractor community that is supporting that project. The bulk of that work is being done by local subcontractors. And they've been finding it really hard to support themselves and cope with the costs that they've been struck. So obviously that flows up to us. The productivity impact flows up to us. Hence, we've had an overall delay on that project there in Singapore. The bulk of that will be complete in the next, by August of this coming year. So again, we think we've got a good handle on it now, really understanding the environment that we're in, and we'll work through that and complete the project accordingly.
You do have other projects, the sort of medium-term, longer-term outlook. You're quite confident those other projects are going to see you through. Obviously, the headlines are all about these two big projects, and you can see why. But you're confident you're going to make progress in the medium term?
Yes, absolutely. We have a portfolio of approximately 60 projects, so we've spent a bit of time talking about two, and I can certainly understand the need for us to do that. But the other 58 have performed very well. In actual fact, have been right in line with our expectations of bringing in an improved margin performance across the group. And we saw that in the 58. So we've taken the loss on those two big projects now. So in the second half, we're hoping that, we expect to see a continuation of the good performance on the rest of the portfolio.
Scott Cummins, CEO of Avenge, thank you very much indeed for your time tonight on The Money Show.
The Money Show.
The Markets.
Anthony Modasani is the senior equity sales trader at Absa CIB. Anthony, good evening. Thanks for coming in. You heard the Kumba conversation with the CEO. Their share price up today quite strongly. On the face of it, sort of bad news, but a lot of optimism for the future.
Yes, Stephen, always good to be here. Stock up 7%. Look, financially wasn't great, but it actually was, if you look on the operational basis, they did what they could manage and take control of. They did really well, and I think that's what investors were proud of. You saw 4.4 billion rand worth of savings that came through. They still paid out dividends. It was a 100% payout ratio of earnings. So I think that's what got an investor's cheer today.
And then First Rand, obviously they're exposed to this issue in the UK, as I understand it, the sort of mis-selling of car finance, various investigations underway, and an important ruling for them.
Yeah, again, back and forth with these headlines. Last night we saw another headline come out that they're going against Chancellor Reeves. They're not going to allow her to intervene. So you saw the UK banks sort of come under a bit of pressure. That translated into First Rand down 1.5%, but then it recouped quite nicely and closed the session sort of flat. Rest of the banks up 1% for the session. So yeah, I mean, I think guys were a little bit sort of thought the knee-jerk move was overdone and they were comfortable still to be holders of First Rand.
It's been a very interesting kind of period. So the JSE, another record high today, building on Fridays, building on, I think, Wednesdays. And despite what seems to be quite difficult headlines, everyone's nervous about the US President, Donald Trump. We don't quite know the terms of what looks to be a peace deal without Ukraine, but involving Ukraine and Russia. What is driving this? I mean, gold is part of it. There are other factors.
Yeah, 100%. So gold miners, again, they continue to grind high. We're going to get earnings from them later on this week. And then if you've got to look at Naspers and Prosus as well, right? So China Tech has been at a massive discount to the Magnificent Seven in the US. And it's starting to, just the positive news. You've had DeepSeek. Now Xi's meeting with Jack Ma, who's come out of hiding, which I think is positive. And it's all about the follow-through that's got to come. So I think it's just about, there's opportunity in China and, Naspers and Prosus are part of that, and that's sort of helping lift the index higher. I
mean, obviously, we don't know how it'll go. It'll be led by many different factors, but certainly there's a lot of optimism among investors to drive this. Yeah, 100%. It does feel that way. I mean, I think it's given the previous stance, Jack Ma was going to list that Ant business and then that got squashed and he went into hiding and nobody could find him. That Xi Jinping's now engaging with him. It seems like, okay, sentiment is turning, but I think it really is about the follow-through and them actually putting something solid down. I bet G could find him. Anthony Modasani, thank you. Senior equity sales trader at Absa CIB.
WhatsApp Stephen
on 072
702
1 702.
Well, of course, that's the number. Good to hear from you this evening. Certain questions, of course, around whether or not we could, should, would, in some cases, pay more tax, if that is what is going to happen. We'll talk a bit more about that in just a few moments. I mean, it's interesting to see, and I think it was News 24 who found the comments by the SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter a couple of months ago, beginning of sort of middle of January or thereabouts, in which he said that increasing the tax burden would not be a sensible idea. People have been saying this for quite some time. The problem, of course, is that government does have unforeseen circumstances. Nobody saw Trump coming in the US and sort of, possibly ending PEPFAR funding, for example. And that money for people living with HIV, AIDS, absolutely has to come from somewhere. It absolutely does. There can be no doubt about it. But I'm sure there'll be strong views about that. I'd be very interested to know where you think tax should come from. If there's going to be more tax, where would it come from? I understand the idea behind a wealth tax. People have spoken about it before. It doesn't seem that it would increase dramatically the amount of money that government would actually have. So it does need to be meaningful. The fact is, I think that in a way, we're kind of taxed out. I do think Kieswetter's point, though, that the real money is increasing compliance, 800 billion rand, he reckons. That really is where the real money is. Goes back to a problem we have all the time. It's around the rule of law.
702.
702.
Stephen is on the Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, on the eve of the budget show tomorrow, numbers from Stats SA today showing that while the number of people who have a job increased to 17.1 million, the number of people who are formally unemployed decreased to 8 million, but the expanded unemployment rate remains at 41.9. In other words, you still have a large number of people who aren't working. Many of them are discouraged job seekers. And these are many millions of people, as you know, in our country who don't have a sustainable income. Ravi Naidu is the CEO of the Youth Employment Service. And of course, it's particularly among young people that we see this. Ravi, good evening. I mean, I sometimes feel that you can drown in the unemployment numbers, and they're kind of all important. But is there any evidence that you're seeing that suggests we are making some progress in helping, enabling younger people to get into work in a significant way?
Yes, Stephen. Thanks very much. So I think there are signs of progress, and I think definitely in the last two quarters, so until December 2024, the numbers have been more positive on the youth employment side. So, in the fourth quarter of 2024, South Africa created 132,000 new jobs, which saw the official rate of unemployment fall to 31.9%. And, I think what we should just note, that's the second consecutive quarter where we have had positive growth. So if you take the months since the elections, let's say June 2024 to December 2024, that would be 428,000 new jobs in those 6 months. So certainly, that's a positive thing. It doesn't deal with, as you say, the 12 million backlog of people who are officially unemployed as well as those who are discouraged. But it wasn't a very important, positive momentum that clearly we need to keep taking forward and chip away at the very large number of unemployed people. But we certainly see, a number of positive signs, and it's just a question of whether South Africa can keep on that path.
So is that something we can build on, or is it only happening in certain sectors that are now kind of full, if you see what I mean? In other words, is there something that you're seeing here that we can build on and sort of increase the number of people who are into work?
Yeah, no, I think if you look at why in those 6 months since the election we saw more. I think palpably more of a positive attitude in business, certainly, and we've seen that uptick in numbers. I think the one is there was a loosening of the investment or business purse strings. People were more positive. I think that was number one. Number two, we had no load shedding over those 6 months. I know it came back a little bit now, but it really compared to years, this was 6 months really good. So even now we see manufacturing jobs picking up because obviously they depend a lot on electricity. A little bit of improvement in rail, of course, a long way to go. And in terms of sectors, tourism has really done well for us in the last period. in the Western Cape, I was talking to the people around the waterfront. Their revenues are up 25% year on year. So the Western Cape has really pulled the wagon on tourism. So I think, obviously we can do very well in terms of digital sectors. We have a lot of latent skills there. So I think that, we are seeing that going ahead. We certainly, there can be more focus on getting, taking us from, 1% GDP growth is not great. But, we projected for 1.8, the World Bank. I mean, that's before this US kerfuffle. But, if we can go from 1 to 1.8 to 3% plus GDP growth, then the engine really warms up in the economy and you should see substantial improvements in jobs. Remember, there was a time when we were actually reducing the level of unemployment quite substantially in the 2000s, just before load shedding kicked in. So we could, we could get back to that point, with a bit of luck and effort.
I mean, I would like to hope that's the case. There are other factors then as well, of course, and some of it's to do with government. Some of it is to do with simply the fact that more people were allowed into the economy, and you really started to see that change. I suppose the problem still, in some ways, is there's a demand side problem. There just isn't enough demand for the people who are coming out of our education system to actually get jobs, and that kind of requires, a real fundamental change. So, I take your point, the economy due to grow this year and then as a result of changes, including the end of load shedding, to grow even more strongly next year. Is it realistic to expect the minister to announce anything that's going to make a major change tomorrow? There's always a sense of anticipation, expectation. Sure, that's human, so we should. I just think if you look at the situation around him, his options are severely limited.
Yeah, so I think the thing is exactly on the demand side that is very important, because if we can grow consistently at 3% plus 3 to 5%, just bear this in mind, Stephen. For every 1% of GDP that the economy grows faster by, that's 150,000 extra jobs for the year. So the minister has to look first and foremost at what can he do to actually get a stronger partnership, let's say, with business, to deal with rail, which is a huge blockage, for instance, or to unlock growth in particular sectors, again, like tourism, where maybe there might be a partnership on crime, or on digital economy, or something like that. So I think if we can get the economy to grow faster and bring in more revenue and just encourage investment, that is the main thing. But, there obviously are a lot of micro and supply side things you'll have to also look at doing that probably take up a lot of his time. But I think for us as a country, it's really, in the end, we have to grow ourselves out of this problem.
There'll be some who will say that there's some things we could get out of the way, for example, and they're sort of in your space a little bit, Ravi, but CETAs, for example, don't really provide us with value for money. They're always in trouble, or certainly that's the kind of media picture. I realize it's more complex than that. Are there certain things we've been doing for a long time that actually we just need to stop doing?
Yes. So I'm obviously from the Youth Employment Service. We don't have any taxpayer money, but we are funded by the private sector. But we work closely with all the other partners, so I observe a lot of that. And I would have to say there is, as you said, a lot of ways in which where taxpayer money is spent, and bear in mind government spends trillions of rands a year, that you can get much better impact for that money. So you're talking about CETAs. So CETAs and TVET colleges themselves, so separate universities, separate to schools, cost about 40 billion rand a year. And one of the things is there a way to make them, actually generate more work-relevant skills that companies want? And they're probably, working at 20% of impact. So that's an example. And I think generally if we went through the whole budget, the minister, I hope, would say, we're spending all this money. How do we get the performance metrics and, the accountability into the system? And I think that'll make a difference. And one of the easier ways to do it, if we just go back to skills formation, you shouldn't have technical training schools if they don't already partner with that sector and businesses in that sector, because who are you training for?
Interesting point. Ravi Naidu, thank you. CEO at the Youth Employment Service. Wayne Duvenage is the CEO at the organisation Undoing Tax Abuse. Wayne, I can't see you, but I can almost feel you nodding at some of that. I mean, there are ways to decrease the tax burden.
Yeah, certainly, Stephen. And to the point on CETAs, I mean, we do a lot of work in this space, uncovering gross inefficiencies, maladministration, corruption, bloated boards, overpaid boards, meeting regularly, paying themselves handsome salaries. I think if we took a good look at some of the efficiencies that we need to introduce, road accident fund, another one, we should be able to save the country billions of rands and then divert some of that to, let's say, one area we think there needs to be a focus on is the criminal justice system. Because for every, not throwing money at it or people, but getting systems, getting the silos to start speaking to each other, dealing with organized crime, we'll start to save the country a lot of money. So without a doubt, I mean, there's many areas which we find quite frustrating that government isn't paying enough attention to.
I mean, it came up when Tito Mboweni unfortunately passed on now, was finance minister, zero-based budgeting. The idea has completely gone away. I don't think there's political appetite for it. But there's still a strong rational case for it.
I think so, certainly at a local government level. And remember, national government funds a lot of local government. That money gets wasted. Bills aren't paid to Eskom, for instance. Eskom gets bailed out. The debt keeps growing. So I think there needs to be a whole re-look and a shift in the mindset of how they deal with that. At local municipalities, zero-based budgeting makes a lot of sense because what they've done is just keep on pushing up the rates and taxes and not really looking at how they can cut a lot of those costs out. Remember, a lot of those agreements just sit there. No one questions them. They go up by CPI plus every year, and there's probably a lot of ghost workers. I see there's some talk about doing a full analysis on people that shouldn't be employed or not working and being paid salaries.
So there's been a lot of, you would have seen, I'm sure, the Sunday Times reporting that there could be tax increases. Carol Payton in News 24, who I take very seriously, talking about it. And then quite a lot being made today of a series of comments by the SARS Commissioner, Edward Kieswetter. He was speaking back in January, I must just point out, in which he suggested that increasing the tax burden would be counterproductive. And his rationale really is that more people would try to avoid or evade tax. And in fact, it would be better to invest that money in SARS to improve compliance. Would you agree with him?
Yes, absolutely. I think, the Laffer curve analysis says we're at the threshold. We're overtaxed. Any increases in taxes doesn't necessarily mean more money in government's coffers. I do agree that we need to look at compliance of tax, go after, the illicit trade, for instance, in tobacco and alcohol. There's about 20 to 30 billion rand wasted there. So putting funds into, and what I was saying earlier, and SARS is part of that criminal justice system, getting those entities to work together with the intelligence, we can go and save and collect a lot more money in that space. So I do agree with Edward on that.
So, the problem is, of course, that some of the shortfalls that government is facing are really important and not of their own making. I don't think anyone, if the US stops paying for PEPFAR, for example, the money for people living with HIV/AIDS has to come from somewhere. If I were the finance minister, I would be sorely tempted to just say, well, we're all going to have to pay for it, hence a VAT increase or something.
Yeah, look, it's going to be very, very difficult. Social benefits, which is now going to go up, that's 12% of government spend. You're quite right. It's going to have to come from somewhere. We have been talking about for a long time, and so is the Minister of Finance, a bloated government. I know with the Government of National Unity, there was a little bit of slippage there, but it's time to tighten that belt. For instance, in the higher education department, you've got a minister and two deputies. Now, that was to appease, possibly the political parties, but it's time to rethink those positions and to tighten the belt. We cannot have the bloated spending that we're having in salaries.
There was a time, particularly during the state capture era, when people muttered, let me use that word, about a tax revolt. They were feeling they were not getting value for money. Things have changed. Our politics has changed significantly. Is that sentiment still around? The idea of a tax revolt?
No, I think it's more of an emotional discussion. We've always said that be careful what you wish for. Tax revolts, firstly, are almost impossible to pull off at a national level. You'll never get business on board. They pay the VAT, they pay the company's tax, PAYE. But let's say you could get them on board, a very difficult task. You just do not want to live in a country where your ports come to a grinding halt, teachers don't go to school, police don't go to work, and you have the chaos that ensues. So tax revolt is a fallacy.
Wayne Duvenage, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. CEO at the organisation Undoing Tax Abuse. Of course, a lot to come on the budget. You'll hear it right here tomorrow afternoon.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
Well, one of the big debates that you hear from time to time when people get around a braai and talk about money, stuck in the kitchen, whatever it is around whether or not you should actually buy a house or rent a house. Should you be paying off a house and basically have it paid off by the time you reach retirement or not? It may well depend on where you live. If you live in Cape Town, for example, putting money into your property will have seen that being rewarded. If you live in Joburg, really just no. I mean, house prices have, I'll use the most polite word I can, stagnated over the last 10 years. But Warren Ingram has promised me he's going to wade into that debate tonight. And, of course, personal finance starting in about half an hour from now. Good evening, you with The Money Show.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Good evening. Welcome to the second hour of the program. It's one of the great debates in finance. Should you own your house or not? Depends where you live. Depends to an extent which country you live in. Depends, I suppose, on your life's plans as well. Are you going to stay in one place? Are you going to put down roots? Are you going to extend roots that are already there? Are the children going to go to school here? Definitely. Siaka will not move, etc. And then the grandchildren will go to the same school. Why? Because you went to that school. You know, all of those things. Or are you in a career where actually we're going to move around a little bit, or actually I don't think the kids are going to stay here, they're going to go to Cape Town, all of those things. You know, those are some of the questions. But financially, Warren Ingram will talk about that. You may have a view, and I'd love to hear your story, please. Did you pay off your house? Are you still, like most of us, paying off your house? Did you decide actually you were just going to rent and you had the world's best landlord, and you went from there? 011 8830 702 021 446 0567. You can get your questions on voice note in for Warren Ingram right now as well on 072 702 1702. We'll talk about dog food in just a moment. I'm really not making this up. We're going to talk about dog food. And then don't forget as well, of course, we'll be looking at what's been happening on our continent. Dr. Rutendo Hundwengwi prepping his papers, his documents, and everything else that he needs to get ready for you. So, of course, looking forward to all of that. But good to hear from you this evening.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
I don't know if the dog or dogs in your life are vicious, brutal beasts. They patrol the area outside your home. They protect you and your family from all manner of dangers that lurk in the dark. Or if they're your little fur babies that lie in your bed and spoon with you through the night. But I wonder if you have spent much time thinking about the food you give them. Take it from me. Early in the morning, some dog food does smell better than others. Taste? I'm not in a position to tell you. A wonderful fight emerging between dog food brands today. Montego Pet Nutrition taking Bobtail to the Advertising Regulatory Board. Why? Because Bobtail says that it is South Africa's #1 dog food brand. Montego says that's a false or misleading statement. Zetu Damane is a chartered marketeer, joins us now. Zetu, good evening. I love these stories. I mean, let me just say, they're wonderful on so many levels. I mean, I have this idea in my head of someone from an advertising regulatory board assembling a panel of dogs and getting them to decide which one is the best dog food. I presume that in real life things are a bit more boring and someone just looks at the numbers.
I think it's a lot more exciting, actually. Firstly, thank you for having me, Stefan. The issue of who is #1 in the category in marketing is not entirely objective, and it's something we love to have fun with as marketers. Because let's take a cola, for instance. It retails for R5, and so it sells the most cola, and it can claim to be the #1 cola. Another cola retails for 15 rand. So they make more money than Cola A, and so they can also claim to be the number one cola. And then let's take the Sunday Times top brand survey, and another cola is number one. And they claim that they are SA's favorite cola. They also have the right to claim that. Then there's the Sunday Times Next Gen survey, which measures popularity with the youth. And they claim the number one youth soda in the country. So it's a game marketers love to play. Try and find a corner of the market where you can claim to be number one. And it is quite exciting for us to try and find those ways to claim popularity, because popularity sells.
How would you know, so if you're in a particular industry selling cola or dog food or whatever it is, how would you know if someone else is wrong in their claim? You can't just, I presume, lodge a complaint and say, we don't think they're the best. You actually have to come with evidence.
You have to come with evidence. I think that's where Bobtail made an error, that they made a sweeping statement which they couldn't substantiate. So to quote an urban poet of our time, Beyonce, she has a song called Ego, and she sings, I have a big ego, such a big ego. I talk like this because I can back it up. So if you can back up your claim, you are well within your right to make the claim of being the number one.
They would have to prove, presumably, one of several things. They sell more, or they sell more for the price, or theirs is actually better, or something.
Yes, they would have to find that corner of the market where they can claim number one and then substantiate it. And that substantiation has to be robust. So you can't say the 7 guys at the office tasted the dog food and they loved it. It has to be at least we tested with 1,000 dogs and they much preferred our dog food, for instance, if that was their claim.
I gotta love how they settle it. Could person A lodge a claim against person C? Because, excuse me, let me start again. So, competitor A produces dog food. Competitor B produces more dog food, sells better dog food, and is just the leading dog food by every measure. But they don't complain. Competitor C does. In other words, they could argue that there's misleading information in the market, and even though we're not the best, competitor A isn't.
Competitor C could definitely do that, but you'd have to wonder what they have to gain from that, because they can't then say that they are actually the number one. In this case, I think Montego could have been cheekier with it. So they obviously took them to the regulator because they knew that they were number one, possibly because they are. They could have gone with that message. So I don't see what competitors C can gain from it, but they were within the right to do that.
We see this kind of thing happening all the time, and I seem to remember, Zet, or your memory might be better than mine. There was a time when the cell phone networks lodged complaints against each other all the time over uses of words like leading.
Yes.
So, I mean, that went through. I mean, I presume what that means is that there's now, there's a body of precedent to decide on some of these things. I mean, I can't imagine spending my life doing it, and the people who do are very intelligent and know what they're doing. But there would probably be quite a lot of, I suppose, the equivalent of case law to determine this.
Yeah, there could be case law. So they decided to go to the Advertising Regulatory Board. You could go to the legal route. And I think you're right, there is precedent with this because, as I said, the idea of who is number one is not clean cut, because I could be number one in this aspect and you could be number one in that aspect. We could both be number one, actually.
Yes. If you are found to be wrong, so if in this case Bobtail, which has been making the claim, has been found to be wrong, what kind of punishment can they get? Are they just told not to do it again? Don't say you're the leading brand if you aren't. Is that all they get?
Well, they have to remove the ad, which is quite a big punishment, because they have invested behind the production of that ad. They've invested behind the media spend of that ad. They have to pull all of that, which is quite a big punishment. It might seem small, but it has a lot of implications.
Zetu Damane, thank you very much indeed. Chartered marketer, really do appreciate the time. I don't know, I honestly don't know if you've asked the people in your house about this, but it does seem to me that it's the kind of story that's just tailor-made for someone to do a movie or a Madam and Eve or a something on. I mean, it is just incredible that this is what dog foods are doing. But I'm always amazed that brands will spend so much time attacking each other. Just, be the best.
7:02. Stephen is on the Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Time to have a look at some of the business stories, some of the important things that are changing on our continent. Dr. Rotendo Hundungwi is the founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory, also author of the book Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Rotendo, good evening. Good to see you.
Good evening to you, Steve. Always an absolute pleasure to see you on a Monday night. Tuesday night.
Tuesday.
The coffee wasn't as strong as I thought.
Wasn't going to say anything. The Total Energies Mozambique, the LNG project, faces a big finance test. And obviously there's a lot hanging on this. And there's a lot hanging on it for Mozambique and their economy.
Yeah, no, that's a big thing. So this big energy investment, Stephen, I mean, this project goes back, I think, to 2019. It was Total Energy, which is a French company. And this is also the interesting part. There's so many players. But the value of the investment was about $20 billion. And obviously, with the insurgency that happened in Cabo Delgado, what ended up happening was obviously the project stopped. And for reasons of his risk and all the humanitarian abuse that was happening with regards to the war. But just to give some context, it was a $20 billion investment, which was going to give access to 65 trillion cubic feet of recoverable natural gas. And it was estimated, Stephen, that from between then, which was about 2019 to 2045, Mozambique would gain probably about $500 billion of GDP revenue. So for the country, it was great. The biggest demand of the consumption of that gas or of that investment of energy was going to go to the Asian countries. Also looking at the players that were involved, there were Asian investors involved, AFDB, and also some key lenders. But two big investors that were involved was the UK Export-Import Bank and the US Export-Import Bank. Now, Total Energy, which is the French company, the CEO says, look, guys, we want to revive the project. We want to get back on track. The problem is that the UK has taken a stance and said, okay, we're not too happy because of our fossil fuel policy. America, obviously, with Trump 2.0 has come on and says, no, we're actually okay about it. So let's go ahead. So you've got all these different dynamics. The government of Mozambique, obviously the whole insurgency thing has settled a bit, but now the President Chapo has often had the challenge with regards to the post-election issues. So on one side, you've got the country that needs the investment because it's going to contribute significantly to GDP growth. But on the other side, you've got the investors because of global geopolitics and economics that are getting a bit of cold feet. So it'll be interesting to see how this rolls out because it's a bit of a juggle. And I think that's the reality of the world we're living in, especially from an Africa perspective. And it's going to be interesting to see how the politics and the economics from a leadership perspective navigate through this.
And just looking at sort of the United States relationship with Africa right now, messy, complicated, difficult, won't say the word, all of those things.
It's a complicated love affair. That's what I'd say.
I don't know how much love there is. Stable coins. So these are a sort of a form of cryptocurrency, but these are stable coins linked to the dollar. They seem to be rising in popularity among people here.
Yeah, so to be more specific, I mean, cryptocurrency, we know it, Stephen, as a medium of exchange. But what has happened is that apparently there's been a growth of using crypto, especially from a trans-border payment perspective, which is a good thing from an Africa perspective. And why is this? The biggest challenge we have with Africa, besides the manual trade of currency, is that especially for multinationals or African multinationals or external multinationals who invest in Africa, getting your money into the country is one thing, getting it out is always a challenge. So with crypto, and especially the stable coin crypto, because there's the Bitcoin, but the specific one which is actually taking a big drive in terms of growth and usage on the African continent is the stable coin currency. And it's been backed by the US dollar. And a lot of this, again, we're seeing Trump 2.0's influence coming through again. The cryptocurrency as a currency has obviously gone up because the US president has backed it and there's a lot of opportunity, excitement around it. But the other challenge that comes with the cryptocurrencies is that a lot of research has been done and they've related the investment in cryptocurrency as an entity of exchange has got a correlation to the devaluation of the local currencies. And 2 countries in Africa have highlighted that from the research, Nigeria and Ethiopia, which is a bit concerning because those are 2 of the top 5 biggest GDP countries on the continent. So the cryptocurrency definitely is a medium for payments with the challenges Africa has, is a great positive thing, but there's economic challenges with the risk that's related to that, and that is still to be determined, and the jury's still out on that from a long-term strategic perspective.
It's interesting to see how it all plays out. The gas pipeline, the Trans-Sahara Gas Pipeline project, it's from Nigeria through Algeria to Niger, and it seems to be back on the table. I mean, there have been some complications around that area.
Yeah, so this investment, Stephen, goes back probably, the idea was conceptualized in 1970. And if you follow geographically in terms of, as the crow flies, in terms of the African continent, you've got Nigeria, then you've got Niger, and then you've got Algeria that then taps into the Mediterranean Sea. So these 3 countries came together, and for me, that's a big positive with regards to the collaboration between countries. We know in that Sahel region, there's a lot that is happening. But the interest of the investment has come out. The 3, I think, ministers of energy met this month. And one of the key things, they said, look, let's restart this project. It's about 4,100 kilometers of piped gas that will go into Europe. The big thing about this, I think there's about 30 cubic million. I'm now talking like one of our former presidents. There's about. I'm going to get myself in trouble.
You're going to get me into trouble.
I'm going to get both of us.
It's a lot of. It's a lot.
It's 30 cubic million meters of gas that is moving across. But I think the big thing that to highlight here is that their supply in Europe, and what's created the demand, Stephen, is because of the relationship with Russia. A lot of the European countries are in big demand of gas, but the challenge, obviously, they used to get it from Russia. With the Ukraine war, that has created a different scenario. So now there's demand, and these 3 countries have created this pipeline. I think the investment, Stephen, is about $13 billion US, 4,100 kilometers. But it's an exciting project because it brings the best of Africa's capabilities and resources into the first world countries, and there's huge opportunity for growth and development there. So quite excited with regards to this, and to see this coming through and seeing how that translates into a positive impact for Africa. I think just to add on there, I think Algeria by itself in the last years probably supplied about 54 billion cubic meters of gas equivalent to, I think it was Spain and Italy. And then that's foreign currency that's needed for the continent and makes a huge difference in terms of what's happening.
And then basketball, we haven't spoken about basketball much, we have before, but the DRC is saying the NBA in the US should cut its ties with Rwanda.
Yeah, so, I've always got a soft spot for basketball. I've got for other sports, but basketball is one of my favorite sports. So you've got 2 scenarios here, Stephen. You've got the DRC and Rwanda. So from a geopolitical perspective, we know there's a huge conflict, the M23. South Africa in itself is obviously at casualties. It's a war, and wars are never great in any way or the other. And when lives are lost, whether it's one person or more than one person, it's always a disaster. But now this conflict has escalated into the sports arena. And why? And just to talk specifically with regards to, let's start off with Rwanda. Rwanda has invested significantly in terms of supporting the NBA Africa strategy through one of the big tournaments called the Basketball Africa League tournament. They've hosted 4 of these finals in the last 4 years. They've made significant impact. They've gained about $9.1 million US with regards to return on investment. They've built arenas, etc., etc. So that's been their contribution, which has been great. We know that President Kagame has used sports quite influentially with regards to position in Rwanda. We know about soccer, PSG, all the soccer teams that I don't support, but everybody has got his weakness. And right now he's bidding for the Grand Prix to be held in Rwanda. From the basketball perspective, DRC hasn't invested in infrastructure, but DRC, just to give you some names, of players that have come out of the DRC that have made an impact in basketball, not only in the US, but in Africa. Think of Dikembe Mutombo, who played for the Atlantic Hawks. Think of Bismarck Biyombo, Oklahoma City Thunder, Emmanuel Mudiai, Denver Nuggets, DJ Mumbenga, Dallas Maverick, and Jonathan Kuinga, Golden State Warriors. So I think the positive sign in all this Kalama is that these are both DRC and Rwanda have made significant contributions. DRC has now gone to the NBA and they've approached Adam Silver, the CEO, and they've complained to him officially to say you cannot continue supporting these guys because of the atrocities that are happening. So that's the sad part of it. I think the challenge that is there for corporate, not only corporate America, but the corporate sports world is now with things escalating as they are from a geopolitics perspective, especially when wars are involved and countries are benefit one way or the other. The challenge for them is how the stance that they take in terms of holding against this. And that's, I think the jury's still out on that. I think it was sometime last year, Qatar, which was investing in Germany, in Bayern Munich, had to actually pull out in terms of their investment because the Germans said, guys, because of the compromises you've got from a humanitarian perspective, we can't continue with this investment. So it'll be interesting to see. It's obviously coming to the African space, but there's a big challenge to be seen there, Stephen.
Dr. Otendo Hundwinki, thank you. Founding Director at Tribe Africa Advisory.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
Warren Ingram, as you know, is a financial advisor, co-founder at Galileo Capital. Warren, there are some debates that I'm a little nervous to wade into. You know, Blue Bulls versus Stormers, Makosi versus Pirates.
Stormers.
We all know it's Sundowns. Springboks versus All Blacks. Well, we've pretty much settled that. You have decided to wade into the debate around whether or not you should actually pay off your home, spend all of that time and effort in paying off your home, which is really about whether it's an asset or a liability. It's a debate that just gets more and more intense the longer around the braai you stay.
And I think by the end of it, there isn't a clear winner one way or the other, Stephen, because you have to realize there are emotional aspects to this. So there are real kind of return on life considerations, and then there is the life in the spreadsheet considerations. And for me, I think we when we make a decision like this, it has to be a fairly kind of personal decision, but at the same time, I often find people make a decision about buying a house and paying off the mortgage very emotionally. They get stuck in the one side of the equation, and they either don't want to or actually don't take the time to look at the financial considerations. And I think you have to look at both sides of the coin and then make the decision fully informed. And it might be that you make a great lifestyle decision, which isn't the best financial decision, but you need to know the deal before you go in. And so many of us go into this sort of property ladder because our parents or our grandparents or someone in our circle of friends will say to us when we start work, you absolutely cannot pay off the landlord's mortgage. You've got to get into the property ladder. It's the right thing to do. And so, we just do it. And it's not mindless, but at the same time, perhaps it's not the most carefully considered decision we'll make. And the sad thing is it's probably the biggest financial decision most of us will make.
I mean, I find it interesting because the obvious thought that would go through many people's minds, certainly has gone through mine, was if it worked for, my father and my father's father, then it'll work for me. And I don't know if that holds so much anymore because things have changed. And then on top of that, Warren, it really might depend on which city you buy your property in.
So let's talk about our grandparents because that's the big one. And what happens with most people is we don't really track the price of an investment that we bought a while ago and keep stock of it for a 10 or 20 year period. The truth is, the turnover of our investments that we own is very high. So most of us, for example, won't own a particular share for longer than 3 years. We probably won't own a unit trust for longer than 5 years. And so very often the only investment that we actually, or let's say asset, I must be careful here, but the only asset that we would buy and hold for a period of 20 or 30 years will be a home. And so when your grandparents or your parents innocently tell you, I paid 400,000 Rand for this 25 years ago, and it's now worth, according to the estate agents, 5 million Rand, it's been a fantastic investment. They're saying that because they know the purchase price and they know the current price and they've held it for a phenomenally long period of time. And so they're telling you something, hand on heart, they believe it. The unfortunate thing is they don't take into account the buying power of money. What you could buy for 400,000 Rand many years ago and what you could buy for 400,000 Rand today is totally different. And so what happens is we look at a price of a house, we know the price of the house because we paid it, and we look at it in 20 years' time, and we're absolutely astounded by how much the price has increased. But when you take the same amount of money and you put it in a bank account or something similar, what you would realize is the price would probably be the same. And why I use a bank account is cash, the return on cash, if you put it in a money market account, it pretty much matches inflation. So actually all that you're doing is you're seeing the impact of inflation. And house prices over a 20 or 30-year period, whether you're in South Africa or anywhere in the world, tend to track the movement of inflation. So actually, your house is probably not a great investment if you bought it 30 years ago and you look at it today and you say, look at the price. All that's happened is the compound effects of inflation.
There's obviously a very strong kind of point, which is that you do have to live somewhere and you want to live quite well if you can. You want to live in a place that you can control, that you have some sense of security, by which I mean tenure. In other words, no one's going to come and remove me at the end of the month just because they want to. You do have to live somewhere, and that obviously would be quite a strong argument in this.
True, and I've actually had someone almost shout at me to say, Warren, you cannot live in a spreadsheet. And I promise it wasn't my wife. And I think it's a fair point. You do have to live somewhere, and you do. Many people, not everybody, but many people would find a huge sense of comfort from owning their castle, where they live, and being able to, put holes in the walls if that's what you want to do, to hang pictures or spend money on the garden, whatever the deal is. And if that's the case, that no argument that it might be a good lifestyle decision, but it still might be a lousy investment decision. And the thing to understand about home ownership is, when you're renting a house, and let's say you and I decide we're both going to get identical houses side by side. You're going to buy it and I'm going to rent. The truth is that your costs are going to start off much higher than mine, because my rent might be 30,000 a month. And the only other thing I have to pay will be electricity and water, the consumables. But I've got no other costs. What you've got as the homeowner is you firstly have to pay off the mortgage, so you've got some interest. Then you've got property taxes and maybe levies if you stay in a cluster or an apartment block. And then every now and then, whether it be every 5 or 10 years, you're going to have some maintenance costs. Whether it's, if you stay in an apartment block, don't be fooled. The whole apartment block has to be maintained somewhere along the line, has to be repainted, and the roof has to get done, and the owners pay for that. So you're going to pay, and you're going to pay to repaint inside. And so over somewhere around a 3 to 8 year period, if you stay in the same place for 3 to 8 years, it's really debatable whether it's better to buy the place. I think in most instances it's actually better to rent. And I want to say obviously, but it's an important point here, is the difference between your ownership costs and your renting costs. That difference, if you're a tenant, you have to save that money. Otherwise, you've just wasted it. But a homeowner who stays in a house for a period of at least 8 years, I think 10 years is better, or longer, tends to have made the better financial decision to be a buyer and an owner, because all the other costs start to spread out over a long period of time. The accountants would say you're amortizing all of those costs. And the tenant will be in a position where their rent has been going up year after year, probably with inflation and sometimes a little bit faster. And so, after 8 or 10 years, the tenant costs start to become very high relative to the home ownership costs.
This is part of a sort of dynamic, right, where the bond that you will pay with your first payment, obviously depends on interest rates, but the rent that you will pay depends only on inflation. So if you look at interest rates over the last, let's call it 15 years, or longer if you like, but certainly since they became more manageable, so let's just say 15 years, you will find that that is what's determining your bond. And because of inflation, the amount that you pay over your bond, despite up and down for interest rates, stays roughly the same. But if you're paying rent, it only goes up with inflation. And so over time, your monthly cost must change quite dramatically, if I've understood it correctly.
It's actually a fantastic point. It's something that people miss, a lot. Is that the early days, you're paying off your bond, you're paying off a huge amount of interest. But the only thing that's going to move that payment from 1 month to the next in terms of what you have to pay will be interest rates. And yes, interest rates are a little bit volatile, but not that volatile over a 30-year period. And so you could be in a position where you started 20 years ago paying whatever it is, 50,000 Rand a month for your mortgage, and 19 years later, you're still paying 50,000 Rand for your mortgage. Whereas the tenant in that position would be paying a heck of a lot more money than when they started. The one thing is, in recent times, somewhere around the last 5 or 6 years, the little silent assassin costs of home ownership have started to rise very quickly. And what I mean by that will be things like your sewerage costs that the municipality are making you pay, or your property taxes and the like. And it's not just your rates; it's all the small little costs that they add on: sewerage, refuse collection, water, and the like. And those, if my numbers are correct, and especially in places in the Western Cape, those costs are going up a heck of a lot faster than inflation. And so what you find now is that those little costs, which might only have been $50, 10 years ago, are suddenly 400 or 500 Rand. And if they keep escalating like that, then all of a sudden home ownership becomes a little bit more tricky again. But I think you're right, Stephen, that the point is that the bulk of your home ownership costs are flat when you stay in the place for a long period of time, but the rent always goes up. I think that, and that's maybe also the trick here, is if you're rotating houses all the time, one of the things people would do is they'd say, I'm going to buy a small house, and in 5 years' time, I'm going to sell it and buy a bigger house. If you keep doing that on a regular basis, what you are doing is you're making the estate agents very happy, because they're getting paid a commission every time you transact. You're making the lawyers happy because there's bond registration and those kinds of costs as well. And then you've got property transfer taxes as well. So the decision to buy, I think, is a very good one over a long period of time, because then all of those transaction costs are spread out over a heck of a long time. But doing it, every 5 years, I think you're really just, going backwards quite quickly.
We're going to come back to this because I have a lot of questions about your sort of life stage as you get a little older. We do have a question, though, from Anna. Warren, she asks, my insurance costs are so high, and I'm wondering if there's anything I can do to reduce them without losing my benefits. A very interesting question, and we'll have an answer for you from Warren in a moment.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
And the question, Warren, came from Anna. She asked, my insurance costs are so high. I'm wondering if there's anything I can do to reduce them without losing my benefits. I can't help but feel that a lot of people have been looking at insurance premiums lately. And if you look at the amount of advertising in this industry, you can see it's very competitive.
It is very competitive, and there is a fair amount of churn, which is a little bit worrying sometimes. I think we've got to look at this into two parts. So there is insuring your life and your health, and then there is insuring your stuff. Now, when we talk about insuring your stuff, that will typically be your house, your household contents, and your car, and things like your phone and computers, etc. And I think the two easy tricks are, one, make sure that you shop around, I think at least every 3 years for insuring your stuff. I think it's worth getting a quote from a couple of providers to say, what would you charge me to insure my car, and what would you charge me to insure my household stuff? And I think the trick there is, make sure that when you're getting comparative quotes, that you really are comparing apples with apples, because very often, you'll have, let's say, comprehensive car insurance, which means they cover your car in the event of you getting, you causing the accident or you being driven into, et cetera, et cetera. It is what it says. It's comprehensive. And then you go to another insurer and they say, yes, we can beat that quote. And what they do is they don't give you comprehensive insurance. They give you insurance that only covers you in particular instances. So so when you shop around, make sure that you do get a couple of quotes. I think at least 3. And the reason for doing it every few years is because different insurers will try to buy business at different stages of their business cycle. In other words, you might find one insurance company is doing very well. They've got a fairly mature book that's running correctly, and they're not that keen to take on too much new business, in which case they might not give you a great deal, whereas there might be another insurer that's lost a few clients and actually would be prepared to charge lower premiums to attract a few more clients. And so that's worth doing every couple of years. Just make sure you're comparing the apples with apples. On your life assurance and your disability, I've noticed that it does make a big difference when you get new quotes every few years as well, because what we're finding is that more and more of these life assurance companies are sharpening their pencils. They're getting a little bit more accurate and detailed in the way that they underwrite you. In other words, the risk assessment of you as a person, and so they are able to offer a slightly better premium than maybe they would have done a few years ago. And again, shop around. Make sure that you do at least 3 quotes. And what I like to do is actually deal with agents of insurance companies. And what I do is I tell each of them that I'm going to get quotes from 2 other companies, and then I make them compare what they're offering me against the actual quotes that I get from the other companies. And after doing that with 3 companies at least, I've got a very good idea of who's giving me a deal, who's selling me a story, and whether I'm doing okay. So I think that's an easy way to kind of cut your costs. And then back to insuring your stuff, the one thing that you should consider is asking them if you can pay a relatively high residual. In other words, I'm using the wrong word now, but there is an ability for you to pay the first part of a claim. And I think that's an important point here. If you say to the insurance company, I don't need you to pay the first 5,000 Rand of any claim, I'm happy to pay that. What it's telling them is that you're not going to be claiming very often, and you're only going to be claiming for big things, in which case they're not worrying about you losing some relatively cheap item and them having to pay, and they might well then give you a slightly better deal than someone who says, I have to pay, you have to insure me from the very first cent of any loss. So I think that those are probably the 2 big tips I would give you, Anna.
That's very interesting. I mean, it really shows you how much thought you should put into it and how careful you need to think about it. It's very interesting. Warren, just on this point of buying a house or not, as you get older, the equations start to change, right? And sometimes, the question of whether or not you own your property that you've been in for some time, maybe brought your children up in or whatever, and comparing that to being in a rental must be interesting. What I'm trying to get to is the equation, and not just the spreadsheet equation, but the quality of life equation really does change about home ownership as you get older.
I think it's a situation a lot of families face, is that parents will buy a biggish family home. They'll raise their kids in that house. The kids will eventually move out if everyone's done their job and move into their own houses one day and look after their own families, which means that you end up with mom and dad in a rather big house that they don't need so much space anymore. But what happens now is they're dealing with maintenance costs and a lot less physical capability to maintain the property than they would have had. When you're in your 80s, you can't climb on the roof. You're going to have to pay someone to do that, and all of those costs start to accumulate quite quickly against people who are elderly living in very big homes, and so I think that, the situation there is a traumatic one, because you've raised your kids in the house and there's a lot of sentiment attached to the property, but at the same time it's big, it's expensive to maintain, and it's a whole lot of space you just don't need anymore. And a lot of people in that position simply don't want the burden of maintaining the property. So I think if your kids have left the house and they're, you're sure that they're not coming back, like the boomerang generation, then getting on the front foot and actually deciding when you're a little bit younger, potentially in your 60s, to sell the home and then move into something which is more appropriate for 1 or 2 people, which is easier to maintain, is a lot easier to do than when you're in your late 70s or early 80s, where change, even though change is traumatic, it's much worse for someone who's much older. And I think, buying a home, into your retirement makes a lot of sense to me, because You're buying stability, which is important. You're buying something which is correctly sized for you and your state of life, and potentially it's a little bit more secure if you move into a small estate or cluster complex or even a retirement village. So you're not too worried about the outside world, and you can kind of limit your exposure. And I think that those are important things to think about going into retirement. But I think buying a home at retirement makes a lot of sense. You certainly don't want a mortgage at that time. But if you're financially compromised, and that's the thing a lot of people lose sight of here, is if you simply don't have enough money to get by every month, then selling your home might be a very good call, and limiting your costs to renting might be the best thing you can do just to get some financial breathing room, even if you're sacrificing a little bit of emotional stability.
I mean, and I suppose also at retirement, you often have a very clear picture of where your finances are. You know exactly what you can afford because things have all been worked out and you'll have had conversations with people, etc. So in some ways, it's a good moment to decide what to do next.
Yep, and you're right, and also that you're not going to be resizing your house again. You're not going to be getting a bigger house because the family's grown, or a smaller house. You know what your requirements are and what your outlook is, and as you say, you also know your financial position. So it is a good time to make sure that you've got the correct property or that you've got the correct rental place.
Warren Ingram, so good to talk. Thank you very much indeed. Co-founder at Galileo Capital and a certified financial planner. Next time you're around the braai and the conversation, should you buy a home, comes up, well, you know what to do.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
Well, it's going to be a busy day tomorrow, busy money show tomorrow. Obviously looking forward to the budget. We do expect the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, to join us on the radio just at the start of the program after 6 o'clock. Looking forward to that conversation. Plenty of analysis too and reaction. Big questions tonight about what will happen with taxes. Big questions about what will happen if nothing happens to taxes as well. We will see you then. Good evening. It's 8 o'clock.